Oh, this is on the topic of Ukraine.
Mm.
You've asserted a few times the importance of winning the peace as
Yes.
opposed to winning the war. Talk about that.
Yeah, all wars are about winning the peace.
Yeah.
Wars are generally a miscalculation.
Mm.
They generally don't turn out the way people hope or expect. They rarely deliver the advantages that the people who start them think. But it's not the war per se, it's the peace that you should focus on. So, for example, the United States in Afghanistan won the war, but then we lost the peace. I think it's pretty clear. We ousted the Taliban really quickly.
Yep.
We helped an alternative Afghanistan political system form. But in the fullness of time, the Taliban came back and we lost the peace. Iraq is a little bit more ambiguous. We certainly won the war. Looks like we lost the peace, although the fullness of time we'll see. In Vietnam, the United States lost the war and it won the peace.
Yeah.
Vietnam is a remarkably pro-American country, as you know, despite the atrocities that the Americans committed there. Vietnam has this amazing museum of American atrocities. It's really moving to see that museum. It made a very big impression on me. And at the same time, the people were incredibly warm towards me as an American. Same towards South Koreans. And the South Koreans, as you know, were on the American side in that horrific war in Vietnam. And so that's really interesting. You can not only win a war and lose the peace, you can lose a war and win the peace. So kind of how do you win the peace in Ukraine?
Yeah.
That was my question early on. I understand that we need to talk about the war, and I have talked about the war, but what about after the war? Is there an after the war, and what should it look like? And therefore, how should we define victory in the war if our goal is to win the peace? So Ukraine defined a victory as a recovery of all their internationally recognized territory, which is under Russian occupation now, war crimes tribunals for those who launched the aggression against Ukraine, and reparations for all the damage that was caused in Ukraine. So those are fully understandable at an emotional level, at a justice level. This is a criminal aggression under international law, what Russia has done. But in order to achieve those war aims, to achieve a victory defined that way, you have to take Moscow in order to impose that kind of peace. So Ukraine is not taking Moscow. And therefore, that version of victory is just not reachable. As much as it is understandable at an emotional level, you can't achieve that in reality. So what's a better definition of victory? A better definition of victory, at least for me. Now, remember, we're sitting here in an office at Stanford University, Palo Alto, California. We're not under bombardment.
Yeah.
We haven't had our sons or our husbands or our brothers or our sisters, aunts and uncles killed. We're not victims of rape and atrocities here. So it's a lot easier for us to talk about the war in Ukraine than it is for the Ukrainians living it day to day as we sit here and speak. But I think we can talk about the peace or a victory as Ukraine getting into the European Union and Ukraine getting some sort of security guarantee. Now, why does Ukraine need to get into the European Union? Well, because it needs that mechanism of European Union accession to transform its domestic institutions, to go from a poorly institutionalized, weakly institutionalized, extremely corrupt state to more like a European state with rule of law, open society, free and open media, and prosperity, because Ukraine is remarkably poor by European standards. Okay. And then security guarantees so that Ukraine, if they rebuild, it then isn't destroyed again. What might that EU accession process look like? What might the security guarantee look like? I think those are worthy of debate and need to be debated, and they are being debated. So that's very positive. But to get to that road, you need an armistice.
Yeah.
You need the fighting to stop. Meaning, you don't need to get all of your territory back in order to start the process of European Union accession, transformation of institutions, rebuilding the country in a new economy and with some security arrangements, right? It would be better if you got your territory, but it would be much better if you started the process with an armistice of gaining a Ukraine that the Ukrainians need, right? Ukraine needs Ukraine. Russia doesn't need Ukraine. They have Russia already. And so getting however much of Ukraine you can control and transforming it into a European country, joining the West is how we would put it. Ukraine wants to join Europe. That's why they opposed domestic tyrants in 2003, 4, and that 4, 5, that Orange Revolution. That's why they overthrew that domestic dictator in 2013, 14, Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. Yeah. Right? They risked their lives to join Europe before Russia took Crimea and then the full-scale invasion of February 2022. So that, I think, means how do you get an armistice? How do you get to that point where you can start that process? That's a better definition of victory, and that's how you win the peace. So if you look at the Korean Peninsula, of course, it's a very unsatisfactory outcome. Yeah. It's only an armistice. Yeah. It's not a peace treaty. Yeah. They're technically still at war. Yeah. But there's not large-scale fighting. Yes, the families were separated. Some never saw each other again because the border was closed. And yes, North Korea does a lot of things that the South Koreans regard as provocations. And so it's unsatisfactory. But still, on the other side of that demilitarized zone, with the American security umbrella, in the absence of a peace treaty, they got an American security umbrella. They built or rebuilt one of the most successful societies on the planet, as you know, South Korea. It's unbelievably impressive what they did. Yeah. Again, it's not perfect. It's not satisfactory. It would have been much better to get a peace treaty.
Better than nothing.
But hey, look what they've achieved. Yeah. And so an outcome like that for Ukraine would be a miracle and would be a gift and would not necessarily involve Ukraine acknowledging loss of territory, right? South Korea doesn't acknowledge that the Korean Peninsula is divided forever. Quite the contrary. But in the meantime, they rebuild.
You've mentioned the EU, but you've not mentioned NATO. You've talked about bilateral plus in the context of Ukraine.
Yes. So right now, what's on the table for a security guarantee of Ukraine is not a treaty where someone else will come to Ukraine's aid if they're attacked, but instead a promise to arm Ukraine and enable it to defend itself. What's happening now during the war on an ad hoc basis could be institutionalized. That's the guarantee they're talking about. Next level up would be some type of treaty, probably not with NATO because NATO works by consensus, and there isn't a consensus to extend the Article 5 security guarantee to Ukraine while it's still at war. Or even if the war stopped, we're not sure that there would be such a consensus. So we have to live in the world that we live in. Sure, Ukraine would love to be in NATO, and sure, many officials in NATO have promised Ukraine, but is it feasible? And if it's not feasible, what do we do then? And so some type of security guarantee with the United States would have to be sold to the American people the same way that the one with South Korea, the one with Japan, the one with Australia, right, is supported by the American people. Would have to be sold by them. That hasn't happened yet.
Right.
But that could also be joined, if it were to happen, by others. This is why I call it bilateral plus. For example, Poland might wish to join. For example, the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe one or two of them would like to join. Maybe the Scandinavians would like. So it's a kind of proto version of the fuller NATO. more than just what South Korea has, which is a lot,
Right.
but less than the full NATO. So that would be a big step forward. We're not there yet. We would have to prepare the U.S. public and the U.S. Congress, the Senate especially, to ratify a treaty like that. We're far away from that now, but at least let's discuss these terms publicly so that people understand how Ukraine could win the peace. You think about Crimea. Crimea internationally recognized Ukrainian territory because in 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up, it was part of Ukraine, had been since 1954.
Right.
Well, does it make sense for winning the peace for Crimea to go back into Ukraine? First of all, how would they get it back? You'd have to take it because Russia has it. People say that this is like Munich in 1938 if you give Crimea to Russia. And I say, well, Hitler was given the Sudetenland at Munich in 1938. He didn't have it yet. It was handed to him for no compensation. Putin has taken Crimea. Nobody's handing it to him. He's got it now. Yeah. And if you can't take it back, it's your potential bargaining chip to get a larger deal. Moreover, if you do try to take it back and you're successful, what does that give you? It gives you a bad choice of the necessity maybe of ethnic cleansing. You have 2.5 million ethnic Russians in Crimea now. Are you going to remove them all in an ethnic cleansing? Otherwise, you have 2.5 million Russians inside your state who might not want to live inside Ukraine and might be available for insurgency or sabotage manipulated by Moscow, by the Kremlin. And so incorporating Crimea back into Ukraine might be detrimental for your EU accession process, for your security guarantee, for your overall stability. Plus, it incentivizes a regime in Moscow, whether the Putin one or the one after that, or the one after that, or the one after that. It incentivizes Russian rulers to come back and do this again and get it back, because Crimea was part of the Russian Empire since Catherine the Great, since 1783. And for Russia, it's mother's milk, and it's hard to see how they would accept the loss of Crimea. So it has all sorts of potential negative consequences for Ukraine. The final argument Crimea does is that, well, if they don't get Crimea back, Russia can use it to attack Ukraine. And that's true. Yeah. That's what they're doing now. But Russia can use Russian territory that borders Ukraine to attack Ukraine, even without Crimea. And it's also possible to demilitarize Crimea, even if it was not regained in some type of bargain. Yeah. And so you have to win the peace. Yeah. And you have to think about all of the ways that you don't incentivize this to happen again, or you don't have an insurgency inside your country that's more or less permanent, or you don't get yourself involved in ethnic cleansing to stabilize, because ethnic cleansing is not a ticket into the European Union. Minority rights are, but minority rights can be manipulated by Russia the other way. So this is complex. It's fraught. You have a lot of emotion, understandably, involved in this. And I'm not trying to underplay all of those dimensions. Yeah. I'm just trying to say, how do we win the peace so that we don't get an endless war, a permanent war, a renewal of the war, but instead we get a stable Ukraine that can aspire to become something like South Korea's success?